Let's go.
Let's go.
Oh, did you want to?
Sorry, I'll let you.
Next time.
I'm in love with you.
Snap out of it.
I'll have what she's having.
Too many guys think I'm a concept, or I complete them, or I'm gonna make them alive. I'm just a fucked up girl who's looking for my own peace of mind. Don't assign me yours.
Caustic wit is my religion.
I would make a great queen because I am so stubborn.
I say when it comes to stardom and Lauren, there are no accidents.
Hi, Karen Peterson.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 151 of Citizen Dame, the podcast where we scream into the void because we just can't handle the madness that is the film conversation. I'm Karen Peterson, joined as always by Lauren Humphries-Brooks.
Oh, just screaming into the void so much these days. Sometimes it just feels like, how dumb are you people? Like, how stupid do you have to be to make some of these arguments?
It's amazing. It's absolutely,
I believe in people learning. I believe in education and knowledge and in acquiring things. And then sometimes I'm just like, okay, first of all, shut up. Second of all, don't speak. Third of all, if you're going to speak, don't say something like profoundly stupid and easily disprovable. Like, there have been more things on the internet this week that I've just been like, this is literally wrong. Like, it's not even a debatable point. This is actually wrong.
It's amazing how comfortable some people are in just being wrong. It's just, yeah, there's so much of this. And yes, opinions can be wrong. I'm just gonna say it. Now, there are many, many, many caveats to that, but yeah, sometimes your opinion is just not correct. Yeah. Anyway, so before we get to that, Lauren, how's your week been?
It's been all right. It's been all right. I feel like everything and nothing has been happening. It's like it's in a weird space right now. I don't know.
Yeah, I hear you. It's been such a weird week. It was funny because like Thursday night I was doing something, or I don't know, Thursday at some point I was doing something and I looked at my calendar for work and I realized like, wait, we're still in a week where I had Monday off. How's that? It feels like I haven't had a day off in months, and I had one 3 days ago. And
There's always been something about this time of year, for me at least, that like February and March are like these weird limbo months where it's not they pass really quickly, but they also don't pass at all. It's very bizarre.
Yeah.
And I think that it's exacerbated by, this pandemic and everything, and the fact that March lasted for like 1,000 years last year.
Yeah. Well, and it feels like in some ways like we never left March.
Yeah,
I keep thinking about like, oh, let's see, March 6th last year, we had the Oscars were over like for a month. They'd been over. I had all these plans. I was still scrambling to figure out what I was going to do with South by, because Kristen had canceled because she got the job at IndieWire and wasn't able to go anymore. And so I was trying to find a new roommate. It was like all this stuff, like this time last year, South by still had not been canceled. And yeah.
But by the end of next week, it will have been.
Oh
So.
yeah. Yeah. It's, and then that's the other thing is like, it's so crazy how everything was minute by minute last March, and how it was just like, well, right now, this is what's happening. And, we left for spring break on March 13th for my job. And when I said goodbye to all my tutors that day, it was like, all right, well, have a good spring break. I'll see you guys in a week, I guess. Because there was talk that like some of the schools had shut down, but our school was very committed to staying open. Like they were going to ride this out. And I believed that they would try if they could. And it took until halfway through the next week before they finally were basically told, like, no, you have to close. So,
wow.
Yeah, it was crazy. Yeah.
Yeah.
It got to even the point where it was like the county I live in gave a stay-at-home order and the county I work in did not. So I was like, okay, well, which county do I go by? I don't know what to do here.
Well, and I have to say, I was in New York City So that was very exciting in March and April, particularly being in New York. It was like, and I think the most exciting part about it was less actually being there and more the people outside of the city. Like, I mean, and I don't make fun of them at all for it. And in fact, I'm grateful for it. The number of people that like called me or messaged me just like, are you okay? Is everything okay? Oh my God, what is happening? I've seen the pictures of Times Square. And it's like, we're fine. We're like sitting indoors because that's what we're supposed to be doing. And like, that's pretty much it. But it was this weird space where obviously a lot of the country thought that New York had exploded or something. It
looked like every dystopian movie you've ever seen that has images of New York where Times Square is just vacant and it's like you just walk through the streets and yell, hello, hello, hello.
Yeah, I mean, it's
so
definitely I've always said that you know that something is really wrong if you ever go to the Times Square subway station and it's empty. Like you know that something bad has happened. And when they began showing pictures of like Times Square empty, Times Square, so I was like, oh dear, I really wish I wasn't right about that. But yeah, it was definitely one of those times where it was odd being in the middle of it, I guess, because for most people, unless you were a doctor or a nurse or at a certain point an essential worker, all the rest of us were just like, all right, well, we're just gonna not leave, I guess, until we're told that we can. Because so that was pretty much our lives. Yeah, it was wild.
Yeah, it's been crazy times, but here we are. We're almost at the 1 year anniversary of all of this, which is just wow. And we're still here,
but you know what? You know what? We have a better administration. There are not just one vaccine, but multiple vaccines. People are getting vaccinated. People are like being able to actually begin to go places and see other human beings. And it's slow and it's not moving as fast as any of us want it to. But we're actually moving in the right direction, amazingly enough.
Yeah, definitely. It's like I've already had my first dose, and that was like, it was getting to the point where I just kept getting, so much pushback, and like this wasn't working out and that wasn't working, and call this number, but then they never answer the phone, and then go and hear. It was getting so frustrating, and then it was like all of a sudden, just crazy, just like so fast. I had an appointment for the first one, and it was like they automatically schedule you because it's the Moderna, so they automatically schedule you for 4 weeks out for the next one because you have to be able to get it within that time frame. And so it was just like, I've been waiting, and then boom, it's like done, so it's been a lot of that, but anyway. But here we are. Last night we had the Hollywood Critics Association Film Awards, which was a lot of fun. That's one of the groups that I'm in. And I have to say, there's some things that I was like scratching my head a little bit, but for the most part, I think we did a damn good job. We gave Birds of Prey like 2 or 3 awards.
I am very disappointed that you did not give them all the awards because it was the best movie of 2020. Yeah,
but we did give Promising Young Woman Best Picture, which I think that's also a very good call. So, yeah. So, I mean, I think we did a pretty great job. So, yeah. I had some lingering frustration that I haven't really talked about because I don't want to like badmouth my own organization on social media or anything, but there was a particular spotlight type of award that was given out last night that the recipient of it was talking about how grateful he is that all his thousands of fans were able to come together to make a certain project happen for him that'll be on HBO Max later this month. And I'm like, you have the opportunity here to call out toxicity in the fandom, and you are just pretending it's not a thing. And I'm not okay with this. If we're going to say that you're, worthy of an award about inspiring people, no. And valiance and Yeah.
Well, I based upon what you have just said, I have an inkling of who you're talking about. It's a very
I don't know.
vague,
I was really vague about that.
very vague sense of who this might be, and this particular individual has never called out toxicity in the fandom in which they make most of their money. So, and in fact, has denied that it even exists. So, I'm not surprised by what you're saying at all. Although it is, it's unfortunate. You do kind of wish that people, because you can recognize that there is toxicity within a fandom and also say that you're grateful for the fans who aren't being toxic. And there are definitely not, there are fans that are not toxic fans, that are just fans.
Yeah.
And that's okay. But there are definitely fandoms that seem to attract a great deal of toxicity, or at least a lot of very loud people who make things a lot more difficult for everybody else that's involved.
Yeah. Like, obviously this is not the person I was talking about. Rian Johnson has gotten a lot of hate, and I think it's been easy for him to call it out because a lot of it has been directed at him. When people are hashtagging ruin Johnson, ha ha ha, so clever. I did actually think that was kind of funny, but one of the things I liked about something he said was like, hey, you guys don't see all the stuff I get. This is really only about 5% of what I've received. Most people have been really amazing, but there are some that are just very loud and that ruin it for everybody else. Yeah.
And I think that that's true. And in fact, I, fortunately, I don't even know what to do with it anymore. I briefly went viral this week for a tweet about Kelly Marie Tran. And actually, honestly, one of the things that surprised me about it, when it got to the point where I was just like, oh, this is getting retweeted a lot, I'm scared. Twitter is a horrible place when you're actually like, oh my God, people are engaging with my tweets. No, stop, go away.
Yeah, when you turn on Twitter and you see like 18 notifications, 30 notifications, you're like,
yeah.
Fuck, what did I do?
Yeah. One morning I got like a little thing that's like 20 plus notifications. Like, oh shit. Oh no. But one of the things that I was actually very pleasantly surprised by is that the vast majority of the responses were positive. Yeah, like they're just good. Like, yeah, this fandom really treated her badly, like all kinds of things. And there were a few idiots, which, you kind of expect and is unfortunately too common, but the majority were very like, I love Star Wars, but also this was really terrible, and it kind of damaged Star Wars for me and all this stuff. So I was kind of glad to see that, because I was like, oh, most people are not psychopaths. That's good.
Yeah, it's nice to get those little reminders once in a while, because Anyway, speaking of things that are totally just great, healthy fandoms and definitely not based in any sort of toxicity, there was some stuff with TCM this week that was really fun.
Yeah. There was. Yeah. Well, I mean, this feeds into a lot about what we were talking about last week about this issue of classic film, and the week before, for God's sake. God, we talk about this a lot, actually. But this issue of classic film and what are classics, and how we kind of deal with the fact that a lot of these films were made in periods when racism, sexism, homophobia, all kinds of things were not just accepted, but a almost necessary part of the culture, and then you get TCM. So
well, let's talk a little bit about what happened. I'm gonna throw it to you first, just because you were the one that called my attention to it.
Okay.
So yeah, what happened this week?
Yeah, so TCM has decided, and I think that this is a really good idea and a really good thing. TCM has decided to do a series that they're calling Reframed, Classic Films in the Rearview Mirror. And what they're doing is they're showing films that are at best problematic, and at worst like actively racist or sexist or homophobic. And they're trying to it seems like they're trying to create a dialogue about it. Maybe that's definitely the impression that their website gives, that they want to create this like discussion of these films rather than simply dismissing them or taking them off the air, etc., to actually be like, okay, these are influential films, these are films that represent certain things, let's talk about them. Totally legitimate idea.
Yeah.
The problem that that I had with it initially is that I began looking at all of the tweets that the official TCM channel was putting out. And they started with Gone with the Wind. And in seeing all of the stuff about Gone with the Wind, almost everything that the Twitter feed was saying about Gone with the Wind was how great it was. How empowering it was for women, how important it was, and not just in front of the camera, but behind the camera. And talking about how wonderful Gone with the Wind is. And I'm sitting there looking at all this, I'm just like, well, this is not what I'm expecting. I mean, isn't the whole point to actually interrogate these films, not say like, well, actually, they're not that bad after all. And so then I began looking at a few more things and actually wound up writing an article that was posted today on our website about this. I began looking at, like, why does, what is TCM doing? And I looked at the films that they're showing in this reframed category, and then you began looking at like what they have on HBO Max, looking at, the kinds of films that they actually show on a regular basis, the films that they're showing this month, which is Women's History Month. And there's more of a problem that I think is beginning to emerge, and it kind of catalyzed a problem for me that I've had with TCM for a while, which is the way in which they shape the cinematic canon. It isn't just that TCM, does a great service, and they promote and they show a lot of great classic films, and that's very important. Some of them lesser known ones. But when you begin to look at the films that they show on a regular basis and the films that they showcase on a regular basis, what emerges is a very white, very mainstream, very problematic collection of movies, and particularly this reinforcement of certain films as being essentials and belonging in the cinematic canon. So when you're talking about films like Gone with the Wind or The Jazz Singer or Seven Brides for Seven Brothers, suddenly what's beginning to emerge is, well, actually, these films aren't that bad. Well, actually, there's some problematic stuff in there, but we're just not going to really pay attention to that. And that has begun to deeply trouble me, particularly given that TCM is one of the major voices of classic cinema.
Yeah. Your article is great. I hope everyone will go and read it. We'll make sure to link it in the show notes too. But I think that was the thing that really frustrated me was I was looking at it, and it's not, the problem isn't that they want to go back and take a more critical look at these films, because I think that is totally fair and it's something that should happen. I got the sense, just looking at the way the conversation was playing out, that the reframing is not in the like, yeah, we need to look at this from a different perspective. It was more like, well, I really love this movie and I want to justify it rather than feeling guilty about it. That's how it comes across.
Yeah.
And that's just like, that's not, there are lots of movies I like that have problematic elements to them. And some that I've been like, I just can't watch it anymore. Others I'm just like, you know what? I know this movie's problematic, but I love it and I'm gonna just watch it anyway. And I don't think either of those is necessarily bad. It's all in how you approach it. But yeah, this whole thing of like, well, but Gone with the Wind is really female empowerment movie. Seven Brides for Seven Brothers, that one was just like, what?
Yeah, see, with Gone with the Wind, I don't see the argument for female empowerment, but I do see often Scarlett O'Hara in particular has been lifted as this really strong female character, and she is. She's also,
even though the movie ends with her begging for her man to come back and not leave her, like
it's still deeply problematic. Gone with the Wind has all kinds of problems beyond the racism, which is really an amazing thing for a film to do. You're just like, man, you just got everything in there.
It hits the jackpot. Yeah.
But so if you are talking in a very narrow sense about someone like Scarlett O'Hara, it's like, okay, I can see where you can make some arguments about this character, right? Seven Brides for Seven Brothers, I'm like, this entire film is a musical, is like a Technicolor musical about a bunch of dudes who abduct women from the neighboring town, like kidnap them, hide them in like their remote cabin, and the villains of the piece are the men who try to rescue them.
Yeah.
Like that's
which are mostly their fathers.
There's an entire song about the rape of the Sabine women. Like there's a song about that. And I'm always like, it's such an odd film to continue to valorize, because yeah, there's great dancing and singing in it, but then actually look at the story. Yeah. Like in what universe is this in any way female empowerment and stuff like that? I mean, yeah, okay, the eldest brother's wife is like, hey, you guys probably shouldn't have done that, what the fuck? But beyond that, like the whole film kind of treats this as this dashing romantic comedy or something, and it's very much not. Like
they all worked out, they were happy at the end, you know, it was just a means to an end, and no
women want to be abducted, I guess, like, but it is that kind of, it's that it's to a degree it's a justification of rape. I mean, and that's what the undercurrent of it all is. And in fact, that's I believe like the story that this is actually based on is like they were literally raped, they were carried off and you know, forced to become the wives of these brothers. And so first of all, very odd thing to make a musical comedy about generally. But the fact that we're going to take this film and somehow try to reframe it as not problematic really is very troubling to me. And that seems to be what TCM is up to with a lot of these films, is they're not really interrogating the reality of these films and the problems of these films. They're saying like, yeah, well, it's kind of problematic, but also isn't it nice? You know, it's like Gone with the Wind. Well, yeah, there's some racist, but it's not like that racist.
Yeah.
It's like, isn't it though? I think it is.
Exactly. And so it was frustrating me too. So I'm looking at what they're doing and how they're trying to go back and kind of rewrite these discussions around these movies, but not in the way that I feel like they really should. But then on top of that, I was just like, okay, but wait, you're starting off with these two movies that you're claiming are female empowerment, and it's March, it's Women's History Month. We have International Women's Day coming up on Monday or Tuesday. Dates have no meaning anymore to me, but so it's like, okay, all right, let's see what TCM's doing this month, you know, because they just had that series about like women make movies, which my frustration in that was, first of all, it's a dude making a movie about how women make movies. Second of all, it was just like, I only watched 1 or 2 episodes of it, but it was just like a collection of clips about these movies. And it's like, you don't show any of these movies on TCM, like hardly ever. And then I was just like, well, let's look a little bit at what their lineup is. So I went to HBO Max because they have a TCM hub channel thing on HBO Max, which does have more movies than are available just on the TCM on demand through, like, if you have cable or YouTube TV or whatever. And I looked and it was just like, I didn't count up all the movies that are directed by women, but it's like, okay, they want to, you know, everyone wants to praise Agnes Varda, who was a great director, and I will praise her to the end of the earth. But she actually, I guess people don't realize this, but she directed a lot more movies than just Cleo from 5 to 7. And that's like all TCM ever wants to show or talk about with Agnes Varda is Cleo from 5 to 7. And it's like, come on, there's so much more. And then I'm just scrolling through the list and it's like, oh, okay, cool. There's a Penny Marshall film in here, Jumpin' Jack Flash. And, you know, there's a few, but it's like, you know, if you want to start telling, you want to put out this series about how women make movies, and you want to talk about like, oh, well, these classic films are actually, you know, really strong, you know, female empowerment movies. How about go back and show some of the classic films that were made by women? Like, I don't understand why they keep pretending these movies don't exist. They keep adding to this narrative that erases these films.
Exactly. And a lot of the films that we're talking about are also in the public domain. So there are some films that they probably just don't have the rights to, which I understand. But there are other films, particularly silent ones, that are in the public domain that you can literally watch on YouTube, right, for free. Yeah. And they still are not showing those films. They're still not even really talking about them. And there does seem to be this pattern with a lot of what TCM does. And you pointed this out to me yesterday, that they will they will create a series of something. So they'll say, we're going to talk about, racism, or we're going to talk about female filmmakers. And they'll do that for, an hour or 2 hours once a week or something like that. And then everything else that they're showing are just kind of the standard straight white male directors, classical Hollywood stuff, nothing that really departs from that narrative. If you go through, I actually did a quick scan, and granted, I did not sit there and write down everything, so I may have missed something, but still, if you do a quick scan of their March schedule this year, there's no acknowledgement of Women's History Month that I can tell. There are very few female filmmakers that are being shown. The only one that I was able to find was Anya Varda, and she has 2 films, Black Panthers and I think Lions and Lovers or something like that, being shown at 2 a.m.
Jeez.
On TCM. And I was going through that, I was just like, meanwhile, they're showing films directed by Delmer Davies and Alfred Hitchcock and Gene Kelly and Powell and Pressburger and everything. It's like, okay, these are great films, but this is Women's History Month. You can't even dedicate a day to showing films by female directors. And I know that they have enough films in their library that they can at least spend a day showing films by female directors. I know that. Mm-hmm. But they're not doing it. And so one of the things that I think this has kind of revealed at some level is that I don't think that TCM is particularly interested in changing the narrative. No. What they're interested in is continuing to reinforce the same things that they've always said are essentials as being essentials. They are basically excusing the enjoyment of certain types of films. So the enjoyment of films like Gone with the Wind, because it's actually female empowerment, never mind the racism, never mind the other elements of sexism in the film. Let's just talk about that part.
But Hattie McDaniel won an Oscar, so it proves that Hollywood's okay. And they were okay back in the 30s.
Well, and the thing, we've talked a lot about Gone with the Wind. Gone with the Wind is a fucking easy mark. That's the thing. Gone with the Wind is a film that has been talked about constantly by film buffs, by film scholars, by critics, by viewers, etc., as a truly deeply problematic film. It's often talked about in the same breath as Birth of a Nation. This is something that has been examined over and over and over again. I don't know why TCM has decided that they need to re-examine it again, other than the fact that they seem to be trying to whitewash it a second time or a third time or 15th time, while also kind of paying lip service to this whole idea of, we're interrogating these kinds of films. In fact, none of the films that they're showing in the Reframed section are particularly challenging films. You know why they're being shown, in other words, right? Yeah. So you know why Breakfast at Tiffany's is being shown. It's pretty obvious. You know why The Jazz Singer is being shown. They've also made some very odd choices, like Swing Time is, I would never argue that Swing Time isn't problematic, but it's like you could practically cut out the problematic number from Swing Time and utterly avoid the issue of racism in that film, because that's the only problem with it, right? So it's this weird balance between films that are either so explicitly racist or sexist that you don't even have to read into the subtext, you just have to read the text, or have characters or scenes or musical numbers that you can almost dismiss. You'd be like, well, it's bad, but we're just going to ignore it. And it's this really weird balance. So it's not trying to really interrogate the issues of classic films. It's excusing classic films at some level. And it's not dealing with some of the more interesting elements of the classical period, including the fact that there were women directors, that there were women writers, that there were Black directors and Black writers, that there was more to be discussed than just like, oh, Hattie McDaniel won an Oscar for Gone with the Wind, so everything's fine.
Yeah, exactly. So it's just, and it's funny too, because, and the reason I feel like that was actually a really good transition from our first topic was just kind of accidentally, was just because when you talk about TCM in any sort of a critical way, the TCM fan base gets really upset. And it's like they just close ranks and no, TCM is great. They do all this stuff. They've, you know, and I don't want to discount some of what they have done, because when my local, I was telling you this, when my local, you know, our local TV station used to show classics all day Saturday and Sunday, and when that stopped, it was TCM that kind of became my gateway into a lot of films that I didn't know about or that had not had the opportunity to see before. And so it has done some good, but you know, the Essentials series that Robert Osborne used to host, not to say anything about him, but it's like they've just kind of decided what these essentials were and then just stuck with that, just to your point. And so it's like, in this world, in this time where we're having access to so much more information, to so many more people, filmmakers that we didn't know about before, they have this amazing opportunity and this built-in platform to really do some good and really teach people about film history. And they've chosen to just not do it. And instead, now we have Criterion coming along, who's like, well, we'll fill in those gaps. And they do amazing stuff, because they don't just have, like, you know, their 5 or 6 regular hosts. They bring in filmmakers to have conversations. Like, it's really cool to watch, you know, Bong Joon-ho talk about some of the films that inspired him, and Ava DuVernay, and some of these other directors that, you know, occasionally they get to appear on TCM or whatever, but it's just a completely different situation. So I know we've talked and praised Criterion a ton on this podcast, and they don't even sponsor us, but I mean, we would take it if they wanted to, but it's just, you know, they really have a much more, what's the word I'm looking for? It feels more like they actually have a vested interest in preserving film history, the actual film history, and not trying to turn it into something it isn't.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that TCM, the more that we look at TCM, it feels much more like they're curating a collection, but they're curating a very specific kind of collection. And they're giving, like you say, so this whole issue of the essentials, they're giving a certain kind of credence to very specific kinds of films. And they're really only allowing for a certain kind of discussion of these films. There is this veneration, particularly of classical Hollywood, and I don't see that there's anything wrong with saying, we've talked about how important classical films are, but there's this veneration of classical Hollywood that then turns into this sense that it was this wonderful dream factory, that, you know, it's this almost nostalgic view of these films, rather than taking any sort of time to critique them, taking any sort of time to truly criticize them. And when they do, only really paying lip service to it. So doing it in a very limited way. And it's become more problematic. And I think it has become more problematic as sort of as streaming has become more prevalent, as we've gotten things like originally like Filmstruck, and then the Criterion Channel, as we have more availability of a lot of different kinds of films, that people are suddenly going like, oh, there's this whole world outside of this very specific kind of cinematic canon. And I do think that in many ways, TCM has curated the cinematic canon for pop culture. And that is something that I don't think a lot of classic film fans have really dealt with. The fact that they have a very white mainstream cinematic canon, and they're not departing out of that, and they're not really criticizing it. I mean, even if you look at the Reframed series, you've got, for the most part, you've got a Black female critic in the middle of a bunch of white guys. And that's the way that everything is being framed. So I don't want to accuse them of anything, but it feels like they're trotting someone out in order to kind of give credence to the way that they're approaching their films. And that there's something deeply uncomfortable about all of this stuff. And in particular, also the way that the fandom of TCM then defends them, being like, well, they do such a great job for classic films. Just like, yeah, but we've got to start breaking away from this. They are a problem, and they're becoming more of a problem, and their issues are becoming more prevalent.
Yeah. Well, and it comes back to something that we talked about a couple weeks ago, where it's like, just going back on this essentials thing, like, you have to be careful with your word choices, but you also have to be careful how you interpret certain words too. And like what we talked about before was when someone says a movie is important, that gives it sometimes the unfair expectation that also means it's good. And that's the same thing with the essentials. Like, I think that started off with like, yeah, these are essential films that anybody who loves movies should have seen. And I would say that Gone with the Wind is probably still one of those, but you need to watch it from a critical perspective, not from an entertainment one. And yeah, so when people hear essential, they're like, oh, these are the great movies from old Hollywood, and and it shouldn't be that way. It that word should mean something different.
Yeah, it's to be honest, I think the TCM is framing itself as pure entertainment, really,
Yeah.
when it comes down to it. These are films that you are there to be entertained by. They're not really films that you're there to interrogate in any sense. And I think that, and again, I want to avoid being like, oh, Criterion is perfect and should be like venerated or everything. They're not. Right. They have their own problems. But one of the things that Criterion, in terms of the way that they curate their system, seems to be trying to do is to get people to think about the films that they're watching, to not just treat it as this is a piece of entertainment, but that also this is a historical document, this is representative of something, and maybe should be watched in tandem with all of these other films that are related to it in some way, so that we kind of build a different picture of what cinema actually looks like.
Yeah, exactly. I just pulled up TCM's list on the on-demand. I don't remember why. I think I was looking for something, and I'm just scrolling through all these movies going, why did I pull this up? I don't know. I don't know, but there are not very many movies directed by women, directed by anybody who's not white, and it's very frustrating. They don't get to be the ones that talk about. Like, yeah, they're done. I'm done listening to them. Yeah, it's so frustrating. Well, and then like on the HBO, the TCM hub on HBO Max, it's like some of the movies that are there as classics. I'm like, Mulholland Drive? Like, that was this century. I don't know. Or what were some of the other ones that I saw in there? I already closed it, but I was just like, I have questions.
Yeah, there are definitely some on there. And I think that some of that is a limitation of what HBO Max is allowing and how all of the various streaming rights work.
Yeah.
So I don't want to blame them too much, but also I'm kind of like, what you people are calling classics is becoming looser and looser. It's really beginning to remind me of AMC. Back when AMC
American Movie Classics is what it used to stand for.
I remember when AMC actually showed classic films. That was back in the bad old days. And at a certain point it began breaking down. Like suddenly they began showing all these films. I'm like, that was from like 2 years ago.
That's a classic. And then they started like it's a new classic. It was an instant classic. It's like, that's not how classic works.
Yeah, and I remember watching that just like, because I remember the decline, right? And I was just like, and that's kind of what some of the TCM stuff on HBO Max reminds me of.
Yeah.
But I don't know, man.
I mean, some of them are great movies, but it's like, why is that on your classics channel? I don't know. Anyway, but yeah, the point is, don't listen to people that are talking about racism in Hollywood and trying to say that it wasn't that bad from the same people who won't show Oscar Michaud films. Yeah. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah. And again, which are mostly in the public domain. You can show them. There's no reason why they can't show them.
I watched a couple of them on YouTube, and the quality's not great, but also, maybe it's a good time to restore some of them and help fix that problem. Might be a good use of some people's time. Just saying. Anyway, Yeah. So on that note, there's a question I was sent a couple weeks ago that I keep meaning to ask or answer, and I keep not getting around to it. And it has to do with cancel culture. And I feel like I want to give it some time, but we've already spent so much time on TCM and we want to move on to other things. So Kenny, I apologize. I'm going to put it off one more time, but next week I will talk about this question that you asked. I have not forgotten. And I will do it next week. I promise. So, but what we did want to, our main topic that we wanted to talk about before all this TCM stuff came up, was we wanted to continue our conversation because even though Black History Month is over, Black cinema is not. And so we wanted to talk about sort of more contemporary experiences in Black cinema and filmmakers, actors. So first of all, we wanted to talk a little bit about the 70s and Blaxploitation and the rise of the divine Pam Grier, who randomly was trending on Twitter this morning. Did you see this?
I saw that and I clicked on it. I was just like, oh my God, no, what happened?
What happened? Did she do something? No,
she didn't do anything. Did she do something horrible? Like, I was just like,
it's not even her
Pam
birthday. It's some random asshole trying to claim that she wasn't hot. And I'm just like, fuck you, man. Have you seen any pictures of Pam Grier? Like, she's still hot.
Have you seen any movies with Pam Grier? I mean, Pam Grier, like, I think had a stipulation in her contract that she had to take her shirt off in every single movie she made for a while there. And like, yeah, I don't know. Sometimes I feel like men just really want to announce that they can't get boners. Like, it's a very bizarre trend.
It's like, isn't there medication they can take for that?
Yeah, it's like paid for by most health insurances, you know, unlike abortion. Yeah. Yeah. So
anywho. So Blaxploitation films. I was looking at a list today and I was like, oh, I've seen more of these than I thought. So let's talk a little bit about sort of where this subgenre came from. And I was just pulling something up here, but do you want to talk a little bit about the rise of Blaxploitation and what that even is?
Okay, yeah. I mean, Blaxploitation is exactly kind of what it says in the title. They're exploitation films that are primarily featuring Black casts, very often directed by Black directors, and usually directed at Black audiences, although Blaxploitation is one of those genres that crossed over to mainstream white audiences fairly quickly, partially because of this whole kind of rise of the exploitation film and the popularity of it. And this was mostly taking place in the 1970s. I think that Sweetback's Badass Song is sort of the first, not, again, you always want to go like, is it the first Blaxploitation film? But it's usually cited as being the first Blaxploitation film. And it's a very bizarre film, fairly low budget, but very much about this kind of badass Black man who begins fighting the white establishment. And a lot of the films deal with Black characters who kind of run afoul of the white establishment in some way, and wind up getting into these major conflicts with particularly white cops, white authority figures. You have a lot of different kinds of films that are being made in the genre. So horror, kind of crime thrillers, even some just basically melodramas and things like that. Some of my favorites, to be honest, are the horror films, because they're this interesting combination of like campy and actually quite serious underneath everything. The Blackula films are awesome movies. And I find it really fascinating how they can take this, fairly standard vampire narrative and actually begin to turn vampirism and the discussion of vampirism into issues of drug addiction, of the way that white culture cannibalizes Black people, of the kind of a criticism also of the way that Black people, so one of the things that happens in, I think, Blackula's Scream is Blackula begins going after members of the Black community that he views as, quote, enslaving other Black people. And so there's this inherent critique of drug culture and of culture of violence and culture of exploitation of women and prostitution that comes into play in all this. And this is all in the midst of like a vampire movie. So one of the other ones is Sugar Hill, which deals with zombies, and like it is sort of the zombie vampires and voodoo and like all of this crazy shit, but at the same time it's dealing with that same kind of thing of Black bodies being used by the white establishment, Black bodies being used by other Black people to exploit Black culture. And it winds up telling these really fascinating narratives. There's also been a lot of critique of Blaxploitation because they do tend to rely on stereotypes. So there's a question of like, is this basically reinforcing some of the stereotypes of Black people for a more mainstream white audience, kind of confirming the fact that, oh yeah, all Black people are pimps and hookers and drug dealers and violent and all of those things. So there's a lot of tension that goes into that, but very often this has been treated as definitely a step in the right direction in terms of equality on screen and of actually representing Black characters as being very powerful, very strong, and fighting back against white exploitation.
Yeah, and then you get the rise of amazing people like Pam Grier.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. It's funny. I was scrolling through a list of like notable Blaxploitation films, and I saw which was it? There was one of the James Bond films was on here, and I was like, what? And then I was like, oh, it's Live and Let Die.
Oh God, that is not a Blaxploitation
I was
film.
like, if you have a white hero, it is not a Blaxploitation film. It's just a little bit racist. Anyway.
I don't know why anyone would consider that Blaxploitation. I mean,
no.
I guess if like a Black James Bond type character like straight up murdered James Bond, which I would 100% support.
Oh, I would absolutely be down for that movie.
Oh my God. Well, but I do think that that's like one of the issues that you begin to deal with when you talk about Blaxploitation, is that then you get more mainstream white films kind of using these tropes and using images and music and actors, etc., and kind of taking over the genre at some level. So James Bond turning into this Blaxploitation film.
Right, because white people ruin everything.
Yeah, we really do.
we do our best. But you do get some characters from this time that have had kind of a new life, like Dolomite. I finally saw the original Dolomite film because of Dolomite Is My Name, which is a fantastic movie. It's on Netflix. Go watch it. And they actually do some side-by-side stuff at the end with kind of like what they did with The Disaster Artist in Room, where it shows sort of like this is what they did to recreate some of these moments. But I was just like, I gotta go back and watch Dolomite now, and it's it's something. It's a crazy movie. But it's just, there's something, even though like you said, even though it does give way to sort of reinforcing some of the stereotypes about Black culture, there's still something empowering in a group getting to make those films themselves and getting to tell those stories and just like make these crazy movies like Blackula, like Foxy Brown, that like they're silly and they're fun to watch. And they would play so much differently if they were made by white people.
Yeah, definitely. And then you get those films that there's some debate about whether or not they're Blaxploitation. So Ganja and Hess, which is a fairly early vampire movie that Spike Lee then remakes much later on as The Sweet Blood of Jesus. And it's an interesting film because it's much closer to being what we would describe as an art film, but because it has some of these stock characters and has this like horror undercurrent about Black culture and vampirism, it often gets categorized as a blaxploitation film, but so it straddles an interesting line. You also have to note the fact that these films develop in the United States at a time when the studio system has been broken pretty much completely. You've got new American cinema. You've got a lot of auteurs who are working. You have studios like Roger Corman's American International and a whole bunch of other young directors who are kind of coming along. So there's a lot of space for a lot of different kinds of films to be made and to be marketed to different audiences.
Yeah. Yeah. And then, so you move from the 70s into the 80s, and film kind of goes through another really big shift where there's still a lot of independent films being made, but there's a lot of like just bigger budget studio movies, but it's not in the same way that the old studio system used to exist. It's more of like a sort of a case by case basis. So you're not getting someone signed on for like a 3-picture, or contracted or whatever, like in the old days. But there were some really interesting things that came out of the 80s, especially with regards to Black filmmakers. It was our introduction to people like Spike Lee, which I actually had the opportunity, it was a totally random thing, but I had the opportunity this week to do a Q&A panel discussion type thing with Barry Brown, who is a director, but he also has been Spike Lee's editor on many of his films over the years. And it was really fun to talk to him. He's white, but it was really fun to talk to him about working with Spike Lee and how they just kind of learned together how to make movies, and just listening to him talk about like the early days. He also I didn't realize I never had put it together, but Mira Nair also came up around that same time. So they all were kind of just these contemporaries that worked together a lot. And it's interesting listening to that and thinking like, oh, wow, there really was kind of this opening up of opportunities for new types of films from new types of filmmakers. So, yeah. I was going to go somewhere else with that, and I don't remember where.
Well, I mean, I would like to, I think this makes a good bridge, because Spike Lee uses a lot of blaxploitation styles and things like that. And he uses that and kind of takes it in a different direction very often, and often in a much more serious direction than a lot of the blaxploitation films do. He also does horror. And so, I mentioned The Sweet Blood of Jesus as kind of, his version of Ganja and Hess is a much more, how do I want to put this? It's a much more linear film. It's less like kind of free flowing in the same way, but as a result, it's just as interesting in just a different way. But so a lot of what Spike Lee does, as we've talked about before, has been this kind of interaction between films that he watched when he was young, films that he has related to as he grew up, and the history of Hollywood, the history of cinema generally. And he kind of folds all of that into his own work, and then comes out with something that both deals with that and then is also dealing with whatever the issue of contemporary culture that he's telling a story about. I think that we should talk a little bit about Black horror. So Black horror films that specifically focus on race as a thing. And one of the big ones, which was not made by a Black filmmaker, is Candyman.
Yes.
What are your feelings about Candyman, Karen?
They're complicated because, oh man, first of all, I cannot wait for Nia DaCosta Candyman, Nia DaCosta's movie. But yeah, I remember I first saw it back like whatever year it came out. I saw it that year, and then it freaked me out so much that I didn't watch it again until like last year, because I was like, oh, I gotta watch that again in preparation for the new movie, and then the new movie hasn't come. But yeah, I feel like it's such an interesting idea, and I like the concept of it, sort of, but it's one of those that I really, part of the reason I'm looking forward to the new film is because I feel like this is a movie where it's like, why is there a central female character in this movie who is white. Like, this is so obviously supposed to be a film where race is really, really important, and race has everything to do with who the Candyman is and what has happened to him and why he does what he does. And then you've got this central heroine that is this white grad student, and I don't know, my feelings on that movie are complicated.
Well, Candyman is interesting because one of the things that it deals with is this idea of interracial relationships and the use. So you've got these two, again, fairly stock characters. So you've got this very intelligent, erudite Black man and this very intelligent, erudite white woman. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the film is about their relationship, weirdly enough, and this whole concept of her desire to be victimized by him, which is, very interesting. But it adds an extra layer onto it. The fact that she is white adds an extra layer onto that, because you're talking about a lot of the stereotypes that have been used against Black men and in order to kill them, literally, right? So the relationship between Black man and a white woman. I think that this gets even more complicated when you begin to look at who Candyman as a character is victimizing for most of the film, because he keeps on going after people living in Cabrini Green,
right,
who are primarily poor urban Blacks,
right? Because this is a project now. The land where he was killed is now the projects, and he doesn't really venture outside of that area.
Yeah, and it's very weird. And in fact, I know that a number of Black critics have talked about the fact that it doesn't quite make sense that this guy who was a slave who was murdered by a bunch of white people would turn around and then victimize poor Black people.
Yeah.
And so it's an odd film in a lot of ways. And on the one hand, it deals with these very interesting themes and stereotypes, etc. And then in another sense, you're like, it doesn't quite work.
Yeah.
The way that it needs to, I guess. And we do have to say that the original Clive Barker story has nothing to do with race at all. It's about class. Mm-hmm. And so to transpose it then to Cabrini Green and Chicago and this kind of issue between white people and Black people complicates it in a way that is both really fascinating, but also potentially quite problematic.
Yeah. And I know we want to talk more about horror in general, but just thinking about what happens with this movie, and it's like, if you look at all kinds of, I know this was like 1990 or something, but if you go backwards just a little bit to the movies that were coming out in the 80s, and it's like there were some really great films that that featured, Black stories, Black casts, but they were stories that were being told by white people still. And even though, like, I love Coming to America, the original, and I think it's a really hilarious movie and it's really great, but then it's like, it's directed by what's his face that we don't talk about. And I literally just blanked on his name.
It's John Landis, isn't it?
Yes. Like, I have tried so hard to block him out of my existence, but
with good reason.
Yeah, but so it's like, that's a great movie, but it's also still directed by a white dude. And Glory, same thing. It's like telling this story about these Civil War soldiers, this Black battalion of Civil War soldiers being led by a white dude, directed by a white dude. And it's just like, it's like you see the progress, but it's also still like, it took someone like Spike Lee, John Singleton, some of these directors to say, you know what, we're going to make our own movies our own way. And they were met with a lot of backlash and controversy because of the way that they wanted to tell stories. And so going into the 90s, and that continued, but it started to ease up a little bit. But yeah, then you have Candyman, which is this great opportunity. And it's like, man, I would love to see John Singleton's Candyman,
Yeah, and that's why I think that that I will be fascinated to see what Nia DaCosta does with it. Because here we have, and I think that she's going to, that she's going to respect the original and then do her own thing with
right, because this is definitely a sequel. It's not a remake. It's
Yeah.
not a different version. This is a direct sequel to the original movie.
Yeah, and I think that it has a lot of potential to be to actually deal with some of these issues that we're talking about from the perspective, of no longer than 1992, but 2000, whatever we're in 2021. The other Black horror film from the 90s that I kind of just wanted to mention really quickly is Tales from the Hood, which it's a horror. It's sort of a horror comedy anthology film.
Yeah.
That there is a lot of that humor and sort of okay, this is a little bit of a joke, don't take this too seriously. It's modeled after a lot of the Roger Corman films from the 1960s and 70s, where you've got 4 separate stories that actually all come together in the end. But it is a film that is directed and produced by Black filmmakers, and is, I think there's been some criticism about it in the way that it represents Black on Black violence and things like that. But it is actually dealing in the sense of a horror film with some really interesting things. And you can see where you're talking about a film that is not being made at all from a white perspective.
Right, yeah. I remember when that movie came out, and first of all, they did not know how to market it, because the commercials at the time, the advertising for it were just so odd, and it was like I was not clear on what it even was supposed to be. It really did, from my memory, and this could be a little bit flawed, but surprise, I don't remember everything perfectly, but I remember it just looking like this super violent movie that was just like, I don't know, it was kind of around the time that like gang violence was just kind of always front and center on the news, and it just seemed like it was sort of this glorification of that. And it's very much not. It's such a different movie from what they made it seem like it was going to be. I mean, I remember to the point where there were rumors that like people were planning on like shootings at movie theaters, and like in LA, West LA, there was like the night that the movie opened, there were like police officers standing guard at the movie theater and stuff, just because they were prepared for like big violence and things. And it was just like, what? Now, looking back now, it's so silly, but at the time it was just like, oh, Black people are making a movie, like, let's all beware, because who knows what's gonna happen. It's like, oh my gosh. And this is in the 90s in Los Angeles.
Well, the 90s in Los Angeles was not exactly a time of great racial equality. And
definitely not. Yeah, but it's just so funny because it's like, California has always liked to applaud itself for being so, like progressive, and it's like, no, really, it's not. So, but yeah,
it's a good film though.
It is
a very good film, and it is not whatever people were saying that it was. No. That's wild.
No, it's not going to cause any riots. I mean, I remember similar conversations when Boys in the Hood came out too. That movie too, people were expecting it to be violent, and it's like, just based on the rumor that a Black man directed a movie about the Black experience in a less less wealthy neighborhood, it's amazing to me. And this is the thing, like I was telling you the other day, I finally, for the first time, watched Bamboozled. And there's a lot of things I could say about that film, and maybe I will write about it. Another project that I will say I want to write, and then I never do. But I think the thing that really hit me the most was, first of all, there are a couple of things. One is a conversation where Damon Wayans and Jada Pinkett Smith, when they're presenting this minstrel show idea to this group of white people, and they're all horrified at first, and like, we can't do this. And then they start to convince these white people of why it's okay. And then it very quickly becomes this like, oh, well, my Black friends say it's all right, so then it's fine. So then they stop questioning it, which was like, oh, that's interesting. They totally, watching the way that they got played was like, wow, I need to, really interrogate myself. And so I thought that was a really interesting way to address the whole, like, well, I have a Black friend who, kind of conversation. But then also what really struck me too, and we talked about this a little bit, was at the end, the montage of just like decades of terribly racist representation of Black people in cinema, cartoons, mainstream movies, and how many of those movies and shows I watched as a kid, and how many of them I loved as a kid, and just realizing like, man, this messaging that I've received since I was very, very young is so damaging, and has had such a long lasting impact, and it's been right there in front of our faces all along.
Yeah, it's a huge part of our culture. And it's not something that a lot of white people, we don't even question it, because it's not about us at some level, because we're like, oh, that's like a representation of Black people, which is not me, so I'm not going to worry about it. And then we internalize it, and Black people internalize it and react to it in obviously in a different way than we do. But it's so much a part of just like how we exist, and the culture that we exist in, the media that we exist in. And it brings us back to something like TCM, who will show things like Holiday Inn without any kind of discussion, without any kind of disclaimer, without really addressing the fact that there is a huge part of that film that involves blackface, and it isn't just, I never want to say, oh, it's just blackface. It isn't just blackface. It is like beyond blackface. And I remember seeing that same montage and I saw Bamboozled, years ago. I was probably too young for it, to be honest. But I remember seeing that montage and seeing those images, being like, oh my God, like I've seen, 3/4 of these films that they're referencing, and I didn't even think about it. Like it never clicked with me, and that's horrifying, but it's also very important. And I think that's the point for at least some of what Spike Lee is doing in that film. He's talking to everybody, but he's also talking to white people and saying, like, this is what you've lived with. This is what we've lived with. You need to think about this more.
Yeah. And it's funny because I know some of Spike Lee's films have gotten criticized for being too much, directed at white audiences instead of Black audiences. But it's like, I feel like there's such an intentionality to that. Like, he has some things to say, and he wants to hold up a mirror to us and say, hey, this is what you're doing wrong, and this is how you can fix it. And that's important too. And I think that's something that, just to get into even more current day, I think that's something that Jordan Peele did very effectively with Get Out, was, he just went, oh, you think you're not racist because you would have voted for Obama again? Well, let's talk about this, and it's great because we do need to hear these messages. And part of that is because we suck. And part of that is because we've been programmed from very, very young, and we need to be deprogrammed.
Yeah. And that is how we advance. And we've talked about this in terms of feminism as well, that it's one thing for women to keep on saying, this is misogynist, this is sexist. The other thing is that men have to begin addressing it. You can't just keep, it can't just be the burden on the people that are being discriminated against. And it's the same thing when we're talking about issues of racism, that it can't just be Black people saying like, this is racist. We have to actually recognize what is racist and what isn't, and how we have engaged with that and in a lot of ways profited from it as white people. without becoming defensive, without saying like, well, but not me, you know. And there is definitely a major desire to say, like, well, but I didn't do that. It's just like, no, but you're profiting from it. You might not have specifically done it, but you have existed within this culture and you have in some way benefited from it. So now it's time for you to deal with that.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny. When I was talking to Charles Randolph like a year or two ago about the movie Bombshell, he wrote it and he produced it. And it was one of those really frustrating interviews where I knew what I was there to interview him for and I knew what the purpose was. And so I couldn't push as much as I would like to have done. But in that interview, he basically was talking about, you know, I asked him where the idea for the project came about. And it's, you know, it's the movie about the ladies at Fox getting sexually harassed. And he starts telling this story about how he was on the subway one day. It was like he was going to the end of the line, and it got to where there was like him and two other women on the subway, and one lady got off like at the stop that he was getting off at, and so they both get off the train, and she just like books it, runs toward her car. And at first he was just like, what's wrong? Like, what's her problem? And then he realized, oh, it's because she's afraid of me. And so he said that part of it was that he really wanted to tell this story that helped men understand what women go through and what they experience. And I'm like, okay, that's a not a bad motivation. And there are some interesting ways to do that. I don't think that what was accomplished with Bombshell was it, but I do think that there is some room for that. And sometimes it is, you know, people have to make films that are for the people that need to hear those messages. But I would so much rather see, in those kinds of cases, I would so much rather see men just listen to women. Don't watch Bombshell, watch The Assistant, which was written and directed by a woman.
Yeah, but I mean, you know, even in this case, we're talking about films made by Spike Lee or Jordan Peele, that one of the critiques might be that they are directed at white audiences. And I absolutely agree. All films should not be directed at white audiences. That is absolutely true. There should definitely be space for films made by Black people that are being directed at white audiences and that are forcing white audiences to look at and face and interrogate their investment in racist stereotypes, in racist systems, etc. And there definitely has to be that space, because without that space, it's just going to be white people talking to white people and being like, ah, yes, racism is terrible, isn't it? Yes, but we're past it now, you know? And Black people talking to Black people. And we can't have that. We have to have that constant conversation. And also to force the privileged individual to actually step back and to listen. And be willing to listen.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that Spike Lee and Jordan Peele and Ava DuVernay have done really well, and why it's so particularly effective is because they're able to show it in a way of like, this is how you come across to us. This is how you sound. And like, I'm not aware of how I sound to people, you know. Sometimes someone will say like, I'll say something and they'll question me on it. And I'm like, wait, that's not what I meant at all. And it's like, oh, I didn't realize it's how I sounded when I said this, you know? And so that's why we do need, we need to hear from people like, this is how you come across when you see these things. But also then there's a lot of other movies that, yeah, I mean, even in Spike Lee's filmography, they're not all speaking to white people. You know, some of them are just, you know, he makes just really interesting films. I haven't even watched like probably half of his movies, but yeah, so it's interesting to me, I guess, when he gets criticized for who his target audience is, because I don't feel like it's 100% of what he's trying to do. And I also think when he does tell stories that are directed specifically to white people, it's for a very specific reason, and we need to listen to them.
I agree.
So what are some other more contemporary films that you would like to talk about?
I mean, I think that we mentioned a lot of them. We mentioned Jordan Peele and Get Out and Us, which I did find really interesting. We've another film that I just love and I think needed to get more love was Widows.
Yes.
And that was one that I had a great theater going experience with because I was in a packed theater in Times Square when I went to see that movie. And it was one of the few places that I could actually get a ticket for Widows. and I was sitting there and there was these two like older women, like 50s or 60s, right beside me. And at one point when the villain picks up the dog, and the woman beside me is just like, oh, you better put that dog down. I was like, just like, don't you kill that. I was like, oh my God. Okay. Wow. And
I was actually telling people, like, when I would recommend they watch it, I'm like, just the dog's going to be fine. Don't worry.
I had actually known that when I went into the movie because someone had said that. I was just like, okay, good. All right. Awesome. I actually don't need to have that tension in this particular film.
Yep.
And then when, and spoiler alert for Widows, if anyone has not seen it, I'm going to reveal a bit of a plot twist. When it's shown that Liam Neeson is alive. And again, the woman next to me was just like, oh, she better kill his ass. Like, and again, it was this wonderful like audience experience. Be sitting in this film that like was obviously just provoking so many reactions. So I think that Widows deserved more than it was given.
Yes. Oh my gosh. Yes, it did. And you know, it's funny, that movie's been on Stars a lot. And so it's one of those where it's become a movie where every time it's on, if I'm just scrolling through, I stop and watch it. So I've seen different pieces of it so many times now. And I love that. That's one of the reasons that I keep my YouTube TV subscription and don't cut the cord completely, because I just love the experience of just scrolling through the guide and just randomly picking something that's already going. And that's how some of my favorite movies have become my favorite movies. It's not because of the experience of watching the entire thing, but just watching bits and pieces of it and really getting to just connect with like a section, a performance, a set, you know, whatever. And Widows has definitely become one that's like, I enjoyed it the first time I watched it, but it's like the more that I've seen it and the more that I've just like lived in that experience of that film, the more that I've grown to really appreciate how good it really is. I still would love to have seen it as a miniseries, but whatever, it's fine. But on that note, we did get a question, just speaking of Widows, and Noah Saturn at Noah_Saturn. What is your favorite Daniel Kaluuya movie?
Honestly, I think that his performance in Widows is one of his best.
Yeah.
And part of that might be because I think that the only film that I had seen him in, I might have seen him. Black Panther might have come out before that, but his role in Get Out was kind of the quintessential role that I knew him from, and then seeing him give this absolutely terrifying performance in Widows was just quite an interesting experience. I think he was great in that.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing. It's like, okay, so if I answer this question as it's asked, my favorite Daniel Kaluuya movie, I think I would still say Get Out, because that movie is just so much fun. It's really, really good. It's very clever. It's sometimes freaky as hell, but it's also sometimes really funny. And it's just a great overall experience. I mean, Widows is too. Black Panther is also. But I think my favorite Daniel Kaluuya movie is Get Out. But my favorite Daniel Kaluuya performance is in Widows, followed very closely by Judas and the Black Messiah.
He's a good actor. That's all.
He really is. He really is. And he very well might be an Oscar winner this year. We'll see.
Yeah. I hope so. I think he would deserve it, definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. So is there anything else you wanted to mention? Any other movies or filmmakers? Or?
I think we've only covered a portion of some of the things that we could have, but I hope that we have talked about some really interesting things. Obviously, we're not just going to abandon these films completely. But I think that it's interesting to always look at the history of films that have happened outside of some of the mainstream things, outside of the canon.
Yeah.
And to note what films should probably be added to it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yeah. And looking at people like Spike Lee and Tyler Perry and Ava DuVernay and Nia DaCosta, looking at what they've done and what they are continuing to do, not just for their own careers, but to support and promote other people as well, and to lift up other voices, but also what they've done. This is something that we talk about all the time, and why it's important to understand and experience classic cinema, because all of these filmmakers, they take what we've seen in classic cinema and they use that as inspiration. They use it as like motivation to, you know, change the narrative. They use it for all kinds of purposes, but they couldn't do what they do as well as they do it if they didn't understand and hadn't had those experiences with classic film.
Yeah, and as always, watch more movies. Everybody just needs to watch more movies.
Watch more movies. It's easy to do. They're literally everywhere, and you can watch them on YouTube for free on your phone right now. Just saying. So, we would like to thank you all for joining us once again today. We would especially like to thank our patrons: Adriana, Allie, Heather, James, Kathleen, Carriata, Mason, Matt, Matthew, Michelle, Monty, Nanina, Nicole, Robert, Steve, Sharon, Tao, and Will. Thank you so much. If you would like to join them and become a patron yourself, it's patreon.com/citizendame. You get early access to the episodes, you get bonus episodes. We're planning a screening, which we still haven't chosen the date yet, but that's coming up very, very soon. Little complicated by the fact that I'm moving this month, so we'll see what we can work out. But yeah, lots of fun stuff on the way. We also have our Zazzle store if you want to buy some masks, because even if you're vaccinated, you should still wear a fucking mask. And that is zazzle.com/citizendamepod. We have our Ko-Fi, ko-fi.com/citizendame. And you can find us all over the webs as well. Our website is citizendamepod.com, where you can go and read Lauren's great piece about TCM and a couple of things that I'm cooking up for this coming up week. Also, we brought back our Citizen Dame 5, so that's going to be starting to be a weekly thing again. So the first one's already up, and look for the next one, new one every week. And yeah, we're aiming for Tuesdays, so hopefully we can keep up with that. And yeah, we also have our social medias, so you can find us on Twitter and Instagram at Citizen Dame Pod. You can also reach out to us individually. Lauren, where are you at?
I am on Twitter and Instagram at LH Business.
And I am on Twitter and Instagram at Karen M. Peterson. So thank you as always, and we will catch you later.
Bye.
Hey! Foxy, what's going on now? Come on, cut that shit out!
You're moving out, brother. Out of town. And I mean it, Link. You think you're back in with those people, but they gotta stick a dynamite up your ass and the fuse is burning. You understand me? Now I want you out. Oh, you. Who does she think she is?
Whoa, that's my sister, baby. And she's a whole lot of woman.